Eric Deggans, thanks for coming on WEDU. Great to see you.
Great to be here as always.
Eric, I think a lot of people perceive the US as being post-racial. That is, that we've already achieved equality, and there's really no need to have a discussion about race. What say you?
I'd say that's the furthest thing from the truth. And the way I sort of back that up is I just ask people to look at the data, look at health outcomes, look at wealth, look at policing, look at education, look at employment, look at housing, where people live. Who are our corporate chieftains who control the biggest companies, who dominates our government in Congress and in the White House. There's just too many in area after area in American life. People of color, especially Black people, have fallen behind, are marginalized, do far worse. And so when you see this many areas where people are falling behind, there's a sense that it has to be something structural, that there has to be a system that is disadvantaging people and making it harder for them to achieve in ways that you would expect if everybody actually was equal. And one of the things I talk about in my book, Race Baiter, is a study that was done by researchers at Stanford and Yale to ask a bunch of people, I think about 1,000, how they measure racial progress. And what they found was that white people tend to look at where we are now and compare that to where we used to be. And you can see progress. You know, we're not legally segregated anymore. Black people can vote. We have had a Black president, but people of color, especially Black people, tend to look at where we are right now and imagine where we should be. So Black people, you know, Black males still earn 75 cents for every dollar a similarly situated white male does. Our family wealth is a fraction of white people's wealth. We are more likely to get arrested and go to jail and even be put to death for the same crimes. So there's a lot of ways of looking at that and saying, hey, we're not where we need to be. And so that's one reason why I think often people of color and white people are looking at the same data, but they're using different yardsticks to measure it. And so they come to different conclusions about where we are and what we need to do to get better.
Why does it take something like George Floyd's killing or some other kind of crisis to begin to have these conversations again, and then they seem to die away?
Well, I think there's a huge amount of social and psychological mechanisms inside American society to encourage white people, especially, to turn away from the racial elements of inequality in America. I've often said that the greatest advantage that white supremacy has in this country is that white racial culture is generally invisible. White people don't talk a lot about their racial culture. They often don't see themselves that way. They see other races that way. We'll talk about Black culture, Latino culture, Japanese culture, Asian American culture, but we won't talk about white culture in that same way. And we have all these euphemisms for white culture. So we'll talk about soccer moms, or we'll talk about NASCAR dads, or we'll talk about evangelical Christians. Those are all code words for suburban white women, or working class rural white males, or conservative white religious people. And we leave the race out of those equations when we use those terms, because white people are encouraged not to see their own racial culture. Because in a democracy, where theoretically everyone has access to a vote and everyone has access to the levers of power, if you're too explicit about how white culture dominates society, that makes it a pretty big target, and it makes it obvious how American systems are leveraged to work against people of color. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of encouragement to shy away from thinking about this stuff. But when you have a video as striking and as direct as the George Floyd video, where you just see this guy laying, and he's there's 3 police officers on top of him, and he's pleading for his life, and they ignore him, and then he dies. It is kind of hard to turn away from that. And then people who've had this sort of voice in the back of their head, white people who've had this voice in the back of their head saying, something feels odd, something feels weird, there are moments in life when I can't explain why things happen this way. And then the George Floyd video happens and all of a sudden it kind of clicks and you understand, oh, the police give me the benefit of the doubt in a way that they often don't give Black people or whatever it is that was bothering you. And then all of a sudden, people get galvanized. And I think it was exponentially, the reaction was exponentially increased because we're all, so much of our life is ground to a halt because of the pandemic and people are sitting at home or they're not able to go to work in the way that they normally would. They're frustrated. And then they see an injustice like this and they react.
Eric, you've written about how difficult it is to have one of these conversations, and I want to get your advice about how to start these conversations, because you yourself have said, when we have these conversations, white people feel defensive and Black people feel angry. So with that kind of polarization, how do you begin to have a conversation?
Very carefully. That's what I would say. Well, I think at the core of it is why are you having the conversation? And so it's worth understanding, for example, that if you're a white person and you want to learn more about this, understand that the people of color in your life have been talking about this for a very long time, probably their whole lives. So if you come in and you're sort of like, hey, I just discovered this stuff is going on, they're going to look at you, like somebody who just figured out that grass is green or water is wet, right? So know on your side of it that you are coming to people who've been having these conversations amongst themselves for quite a while, and you're trying to join in and you're trying to learn, and it's very much about what they are going through and what they need, and not so much about you trying to prove that you're a great person. And then for people of color who have white people who are coming to them and wanting to talk about this, it will require a bit of tolerance, probably, understanding that you're talking to people like black people to survive in America have had to think about race steadily throughout the course of their lives. And, it can sometimes be an odd experience to talk to a white person who has not had to do that and probably has not done that. After the George Floyd video happened, I just wound up, by coincidence, having conversations with a couple of people that I knew from my freshman year in college and that I knew from when I was in high school. And these were white people who did not understand the racism that I was facing growing up as a young Black man I grew up in Indiana, in Gary, Indiana, and I went to school in Southern Indiana, in Bloomington, Indiana, in the 1980s. And there was a lot of racism around then, but they were unaware of it because white people are encouraged to be unaware of it. And so when I talked to them about these issues, I had to sort of realize, okay, they didn't know. And now I'm telling them, and now hopefully they will react better, and hopefully they will learn something. So people of color have to have a little bit of tolerance, a little bit of patience, and understand that they're talking to people who may not have the vocabulary, who may not know exactly what's going on. They have not talked about these issues as much as we have. And even though it seems inexplicable that something like 8 years after Trayvon Martin was killed in Sanford, Florida, that people still are learning about police brutality and how it affects people of color, it is true that people are still learning, and we want to be tolerant and bring along people who, in good faith, are trying to learn more.
We've seen this shift in culture. It's now easier to take down a Confederate statue. More people want to be disassociated from the Confederate flag. We've seen the change in the name of the football team in Washington, D.C. There seems to be, just all of the sudden, there seems to be this move to try to erase more of the racist symbols in our society. Why the sudden shift?
Well, one thing I think I would credit that with, and of course I haven't done any involved studies in this, is that younger generations are less tolerant of prejudice and stereotyping than older generations are. And I think there's enough of a younger generation now that has decided that if there's a football team that has a racial slur in its name, I'm not going to buy the products associated with that team. If there is a statue erected in my hometown to a slaver, I'm going to go out with, a couple dozen of my closest friends, and we're going to pull it down. There is less tolerance amongst younger, more active people to tolerate some of these things. And corporations have realized that you can get canceled in a minute. Just ask the people who produce the TV shows Cops or Live PD. They actually were canceled within days. So, so to avoid that, corporate sponsors are shifting quickly, and when they shift quickly, their money shifts quickly, and then the people who own the football team in Washington D.C. realize, well, we're not going to have any corporate sponsors. We better shift quickly too. And then the next thing you know, everyone looks around and says, hey, there's a lot of people out there who agree with me that this stuff is terrible and it should change. And it starts to gain momentum. But I think young people are a big part of this equation.
Eric, we're almost out of time, but at one point you write that it's often viewed, the issue of discussing race is often viewed as a Black issue, but you say that white people have a lot at stake here. Nobody owns this issue, you say.
Yeah, exactly, because just think about it. It's logic. If we eliminate strategic racism in America, then our best minds can be on the front lines of every social problem that we have. I remember interviewing the woman who wrote Hidden Figures, the book about the Black women who helped NASA do calculations for, the space program. And in the book, she talks about how she thinks the American space program may have lagged behind the Soviets at first because the Soviets allowed women to be part of their engineering teams. So it was more likely that they had their smartest minds working on their toughest mathematical problems. And so I think white people will benefit. Businesses get better. TV shows get better. Entertainment gets better. All these things in life will get better if we really have a meritocracy in America. And by the way, working class white people who are often oppressed in similar ways that Black people are oppressed, they will find that their lives will get better. Their healthcare will get better. They will be treated better, because one thing that's been used to oppress Black people, these racial issues have been used as a wedge to divide working class people in America and keep them from working together to improve things for everybody who's working class in America. So that will get better as well. I think there's a lot of things that will get better if we figure out how to make our society a true meritocracy rather than just saying it is one.
Eric Deggans, thank you for coming on the conversation about race here on WEDU.
Thank you so much for having me.